Okay, I thought I'd give a little talk today on a collection of shorebirds that are in the Fenimore Farm Museum in Cooperstown, New York. For years, decoy collectors have called these shorebirds, which are undoubtedly the finest painted shorebird decoys ever made. They've attributed them to a guy named John Dilley, who his identity for over these 60 years since his name first appeared has remained a mystery. We've never been able to identify him. In the summer of 2016, Gigi Hopkins and Amy Montague put together an exhibit of shorebirds attributed to John Dilley that belonged to the Fenimore Museum in Cooperstown, New York. The display was at the Mass Audubon Society in Canton, Massachusetts. The shorebirds represented 8 different species that are part of their collection. What we found was so incredible was I found out that not only did this museum in Cooperstown have these 8 wonderful shorebird decoys, but they had 3 dozen of them in their collection, which would be the largest and greatest collection of Dilley shorebirds anywhere. One of the shorebirds on display, a curlew, had the brand of Henry C. Squires, which was a sporting goods store in New York City that operated from 1873 to 1912, when its contents were sold at a bankruptcy auction. We can go to the brochure. This was the flyer that they put out for this exhibit. Talked a little bit about John Dilley, or who these shorebird decoys, and she credited, Gigi Hopkins credited Joe French, an early collector, for putting together a lot of the information to attribute these birds to John Dilley. But we'll get back to that a little bit later. One of the shorebirds, next. One of the shorebirds in the display, like I said, had this brand cold stamp from Henry C. Squires, this sporting goods store that operated in 1873 to 1912 in New York City. They sold all sorts of different sporting goods stores. In here we can see snipe decoys, handmade, shaped and painted from life, the finest decoys ever produced, can be furnished only in limited quantities. They were being sold for $12 a dozen. This sales brochure was from 1890. What's also interesting, if we see all the way up at the top, they sold duck decoys as well for $12 a dozen. Those duck decoys they were selling were by the Stevens brothers of Weedsport, New York. It talks about how you could screw the heads off of them to take them into the field. They were wonderfully painted. They also sold, a guy named Fred Allen in Illinois used to make these stands where you would shoot a duck and put it in this form and you could float them. They sold those, they sold creels, they sold all sorts of stuff. It was a very exquisite sporting goods store. In 1955, a representative from the Fenimore Museum purchased 36 Dilley shorebirds from a lady named Mary Norris, who lived in Gibson Island, Maryland, for $50. About 50 cents more a piece than Henry C. Squires sold them for in 1890. They had belonged to her husband, a guy named Murdoch Norris, and were passed on to her after he died. This guy Murdoch was a fairly wealthy man. He was the secretary of a company called Warren Manufacturing, which was in Warren Mills, Maryland, and they sold cotton sail duck and other industrial textiles. The museum had no documentation on how they became aware of the group or why Mrs. Norris sold them to them, although they have no ideas how the Norris family acquired the rig, they had speculated that they were perhaps purchased from a sporting goods store that closed, since they were never used. And this could indicate that Mr. Morris or someone that he knew purchased them at that Squires bankruptcy auction. Again, that was held in 1912 at their location on Broadway in New York City to sell the contents. Here you can see on one of the decoys a curlew in the collection. You can see the Henry C. Squires cold stamp. Reportedly, Squires would cold stamp one of every dozen they sold. Out of the 3 dozen that the museum purchased, only the curlew had this cold stamp on them. So we know that they did come from Henry C. Squires. We can only guess that they possibly came from this bankruptcy auction. Now, when the museum purchased them in 1955, they had no idea what they were. All they knew, they were fantastic. The painting was exquisitely done. The composition of the group of 36 included 4 curlews. What's interesting about this group of shorebirds, some of the finest Dilley shorebirds, or what we call Dilley shorebirds, had carved wings. All 36 of the ones that the Fenimore Museum purchased are all smooth. But you can see the wonderful detail in the painting, like they were painted by a professional painter, not what you might think is your average decoy maker. They have 4 curlews in the collection. They have split tails. And we can show the other side. This is the same curlew. Every one of the shorebirds in the exhibit have the species painted on the bottom. As you can see, this one says curlew. We believe that the name was written on these shorebirds so that the clerks in Henry C. Squires would know what they're selling, because I guarantee you, and if you lived in New York City, you probably didn't know a whole lot about shorebirds species. The number you see on there is the accession number from the museum. And I just noticed this when I was putting these photos together the other day. Underneath of that curlew, you can see in pencil that whoever sold them to Squires probably wrote those species in pencil. I'm guessing that Squires put them in ink just to make them more visible. We'll go through some of the other species of shorebirds in their exhibit. This here is a greater yellowlegs. Again, it has the split tail carving, wonderful paint. Again, we have the other side. I think this is the greater yellowlegs. Let's look at the species here. Oh no, this is a willet. This is a willet. Again, you can see in pencil underneath of them, it has the species name. And when I noticed this, it reminded me that quite a few of the Stevens brothers decoys, their duck decoys, also would have their name written in pencil on the bottom. So again, Peter Muller, who was a big Stevens collector, he speculated that they were probably, again, done so the clerks in the sporting goods stores would know what they're selling. They would know the difference between a redhead and a bluebill and a canvasback. Now, let's go through some more of these. All right, this here is a dowitcher. Dowitch is what they called a dowitcher. I'm sure it's some kind of slang or something for what a dowitcher was. This is a ruddy turnstone. Quite interesting. The dowitcher, they have 5 dowitchers in their collection. This ruddy turnstone, one sold last year at auction out of Allen's Hayes collection for $115,000. The Fenimore Farm Museum has 8 of these. 8 of these. It's gone. There's the other side of it. You can see, I mean, the detail and paint on these I think the only decoy maker who maybe came close to the artistry in these is maybe Elmer Kroll on some of his finest shorebird decoys. But one noted feature of all these Dilley shorebirds is the way that he painted the paint on an angle into the face. It's not just a straight line, but that's one attribute you'll find on all Dilley shorebirds. There's the other side of that one. I guess I must have done a couple turnstones. Now they called ruddy turnstones, they called them brant birds. I don't know where that name came from, but that's what they called them. Again, you can see this pencil writing underneath of there. I couldn't make out what they said, but somebody before Squires acquired them did write that name on there. And here we have a robin snipe. You can see a nice spring plumage, ruddy breast. There's the other side of that. There's another one, another ruddy robin snipe. The only place that I've noticed any paint loss to these decoys are to the bills. And I'm guessing it was a harder wood that probably didn't hold the paint as well. Because there is some of the birds in the collection that do have flaking on the bill, but the paint otherwise is spectacular. And there we go, robin snipe. There's a black-bellied plover. Let me see, they have 4 black-bellied plovers in their collection. And they did call these black-breast plover. Okay. Now this is a golden plover. You can see the golden spots on the back of it, the little golden spots. And they called these greenback plovers. Greenback plovers. And there are 3 of them in their collection. 5 robin snipes. It's incredible. And this must be the greater yellowlegs. Again, it has the split tail, the willet, the curlews, and the yellowlegs have the split tail. Otherwise, they don't. There we go, it's the large yellow legs. And again, you can see where it looks like somebody wrote large yellow legs on the bottom. So like I said, I'm guessing that one of the clerks said, well, let's just write it in ink or something to make it stand out a little better so we know what we have. Now, like I say, the Fenimore Farm Museum, when they purchased them, and for nearly 30 years, they had no idea who made these shorebirds. All they know is the lady who purchased them for the museum thought they were fabulous, and they put them in their collection. Well, I'm not sure how, but in 1983, and I was able to garner this from some of the notes from the curator at the museum as well as some of the research that Gigi Hopkins had done. In 1983, Billy Bourne, whose father, Richard Bourne, owned the Bourne Auction Company on Hyannis, he appraised their collection, and he's the one who told them that they were made by John Dilley. We'll talk about how that attribution came about. But anyhow, he did advise the museum on a number which he told them they should consider to deaccession, and they did sell 3 of them. They sold a curlew with a replaced bill, and it's the only example in the entire collection I've seen had any damage, and I'm guessing the damage might have been a result of while they owned them, but I don't know that. There was a lesser yellowlegs and a ruddy turnstone. It's the only lesser yellowlegs in their collection, but they sold those 3 to the Bourne auction house in 1987. Now again, they paid $50 for 36 of them. They sold a curlew for $8,000. They sold a ruddy turnstone for $7,000, and the lesser yellowlegs for $8,500. The only thing I can guess is that maybe they decided that the paint wasn't as good as the other examples, or maybe I think Billy was probably just trying to twist her arm to get some consignments. They first displayed the shorebirds in 1983, which they called A Shifting Wind, Views of American Folk Art. And this was the first time they had ever debuted them as under the attribution of John Dilley. They were subsequently exhibited in 1996. At some point, Gigi Hopkins and Amy Montague heard about the collection and borrowed the birds, including 8 of them in their exhibit at the Mass Audubon Society. Now, the reported maker of these exquisitely painted birds has remained a mystery. They sort of avoided the decoy collecting community since they were first christened with the John Dilley attribution in the 1960s. But in the roughly 60 years that these birds have been called John Dilley shorebirds, no one has ever been able to find this mysterious maker. They've checked census reports, tax records, property records. They looked on Long Island, New York City. They looked all over for John Dilley, but nobody's ever been able to positively identify someone named John Dilley. Joel Barber, who wrote the first book on decoy collecting, wildfowl decoys, in 1934, had written nothing about John Dilley shorebirds. He somehow never ran across them. The first time that these shorebirds ever appeared in a book was when Bill Mackey published American Bird Decoys in 1965. He writes about having acquired 4 examples from a lady named Mrs. Jessie Birdsall, who was from Barnegat, New Jersey, in the fall of 1941. Since Birdsall himself was a decoy maker, that's what Mackey called them in his book, American Bird Decoys. He said the 6 were from Barnegat. He bought these, like I say, in 1941. He published this book in 1965. So 25 years later, he says, you know, I got these in New Jersey, but in the last 25 years, most of them have shown up in Long Island. So maybe Jessie Birdsall didn't make them. But he did say that he doubted that Birdsall made them, but he said their paint patterns are superb. And what he really liked about them is these weren't decoratives. These were hunting shorebirds. You know, definitely, as we like to say sometimes, made better than they had to be. Well, a few years later, and these are the 4 of the 6 shorebirds that he bought from Mrs. Birdsall, which he calls Jess Birdsall type. And these are the first time we saw them pictured in a book. A few years later, Milt Weiler, who was a sporting artist, published a portfolio called Classic Shorebird Decoys. He did the paintings, and they did a series of prints. I forget how many were in the set. But Bill Mackey wrote the description for that portfolio. He wrote the text for it. And he goes, "These incredibly well-painted birds have an origin that's still vague and uncertain. Some have a stencil using green ink and the word Dilley. One collector saw 6 in a box that indicated they were sold as a commercial item. The box was also stamped John Dilley." And in that text, Mackey wrote that Dilley's residence was probably in Quogue, New York, which is on Long Island. So that's the first time we ever heard the name John Dilley associated with these shorebirds. Like I said, subsequently, people have looked for this John Dilley. They've looked all over and they never were able to find him. Well, one of the early aficionados of Dilley decoys was an early collector named Joe French, who was he was from St. Louis. He moved to the Florida Keys. He loved Dilley shorebirds. He had a large collection of them. And in 1994, he did a cover story for me for Decoy magazine on John Dilley. And like I said, some of these shorebirds have the name Dilley written in pencil on the bottoms. Well, in the article, oddly enough, Joe says he spoke to every Long Island collector he knew, every single one of them. No one had ever heard of this box. No one had ever seen this stample. And honestly, no one had ever seen a green labeled bird that's labeled in green on the bottom. As we saw in this earlier collection here, they got black ink and some have pencil, but no one ever saw this green. Nonetheless, Joe was convinced that John Dilley had made these birds. And the reasoning behind it was he said that he talked to a bunch of collectors who had these shorebirds in their collection. He wanted to know if anyone had one that they had purchased prior to Mackey writing the name John Dilley with that Dilley pencil signature. And there were people who owned them in the 50s, and they had Dilley in pencil written on the bottom of it. And that was enough to convince Joe that John Dilley was the maker. However, if we can go to the next one here. This is, it's hard to see here, but this is, again, the bottom of a different Dilley shorebird. You can see the Henry C. Squires cold stamp here. And up here, you can barely see, in pencil, Dilley signed to the bottom of that shorebird. Now, my contention, if John Dilley made these shorebirds, tell me why he would buy them from Henry C. Squires. I would be more convinced that this Dilley person could well have been the guy who simply owned a rig of them and hunted them. Put his name on the bottom of them, just as you see names on the bottom of duck decoys and brands and what have you. He labeled them as his birds, I'm convinced. Now, and the other thing is that the last thing that Henry C. Squires would want you to know is who made these shorebirds. Because Henry C. Squires would want you to buy them from him. So he would have not sold a shorebird with John Dilley's name on it. So you could go find John Dilley and buy them directly from John Dilley. Why come to Henry C. Squires? So again, to me, that would be a marketing faux pas to give away your source. Just like you see these Oliver Lawson miniatures from the 50s with the duck house labels on the bottom. None of them have Oliver Lawson's signature on them because the lady didn't want anybody to know where to get them other than her. Now, so again, I'm going to say it's probably a personal hunting rig, and that's just my guess. The one thing I failed to do when I did this article for Decoy magazine is I should have asked collectors to tell me if you have one of these shorebirds with the Dilley signature on it and what the species was, so I could maybe start to get an idea how many actually have the signature, because I don't know. Is it 6? Is it 12? But either way, 6 or 12 to me sounds like a nice little gunning rig. Now, some collectors theorized that whoever made these shorebirds had them painted by a talented artist. I would tend to agree with that. I conjectured in the article that that whoever painted them would have had to been extremely familiar with the subject at hand, particularly since some of these are painted in spring plumage, some are painted in winter plumage, some are painted in transitional plumage. That it would have had to be a shorebird hunter that was very familiar with them, or maybe even an ornithologist, someone who would be vaguely, really familiar with them. But I got a call from Cameron McIntyre after he read the article, and he goes, "Joe, I just want to share a term with you." He goes, "You notice in Squire's brochure it says painted from life." He goes, "That's an artistic term." He goes, "What that means is if you paint a bowl of fruit, that bowl of fruit's in front of you. And if you're painting these shorebirds, you could have given anybody, a talented painter, you could have given a professional painter a taxidermied shorebird and said, paint this. He's painting it from life." And, I don't know how we'll ever be able to prove it, but, I really do believe that somebody made these and somebody else painted them. I don't think the same person did both. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about this search for John Dilley. Like I said, for years and years and years and years, people have tried to see desperately if they can ever find this John Dilley. And what I always heard was, no one could find one. Nobody could find one. Well, oddly enough, I was given access to the research that Gigi Hopkins had done when she put this exhibit together. Gigi found 2 John Dilleys, 2 of them. And oddly enough, there could be a little association between the Dilley family and Henry C. Squires, although I can't prove that. Prior to moving to New York City, Henry C. Squires was born in Binghamton, New York in 1836, and he lived there for the first 33 years of his life. And oddly enough, according to this research by Gigi, there was a John Dilley who lived just miles from Binghamton and died there in 1859 during the first 25 years of Henry C. Squires' life. Is it possible that Squires could have known him? We don't know that. But what I think we can say without a doubt is this guy died in 1859, this Dilley, this John Dilley, and that's way too early to be associated with these shorebirds in any way. However, I talked to Mike Daly, who I worked with on his book on Susquehanna Flats decoys, and Mike loves to do ancestry research. And I said, Mike, see if you can dig up. I gave him, this information. Oddly enough, or interestingly enough, the grandfather of Henry C. Squires, who was named Silas Squires, and the father of this John Dilley from Binghamton, New York, whose name was Revidell Dilley, both of them served as officers in the Connecticut militia during the Revolutionary War. And both moved from Connecticut to New York around the turn of the 19th century. If in any way these 2 men were indeed friends prior to their move, it's possible that the 2 families could have maintained a relationship. However, there isn't any indication that the Squires maintained any contact with Dilley after that move to New York in 1869 when he went to move there to open his sporting goods store. Now this second one I found more interesting. Gigi also found the name of a John S. Dilley, who was cited in a New Jersey newspaper in 1883 that he was getting married. Now, she wasn't able to make any connection between the Dilley from Binghamton or this Dilley from Hancock, New Jersey. But Hancock, New Jersey is sort of right across from New York City Harbor. It's on the Jersey coast. 1883, that's 10 years after Squires opened his sporting goods store in New York City. Is it possible that he knew of Squires from his, like I said, we can't tie these two Dilleys together, but his proximity to New York City sure would have made it seem possible that he could have bought a rig of shorebirds, wrote his name on the bottom, Dilley, and hunted them. Again, over the years, due to the writing on the species on the bottom of most of them, some collectors conjecture that they were carved by one individual and painted by another. Some possibly have suggested that maybe the decoys were painted by the same person that painted John Blair decoys out of Philadelphia, or if they were painted in Philadelphia. But to go back to Mackey's statement in his book, he goes, by whatever name they are called, their paint patterns are superb, and their desirability to the decoy collecting community is unquestionable. And there's no doubt that whoever from the Fenimore Museum first laid eyes on these shorebirds, they likely felt the same. And for the grand sum of $50, they purchased arguably the finest group of John Dilley shorebirds in existence, with little or no regard for their origin. Unless additional clues are discovered going forward, the maker and/or painter of these wonderful shorebirds will probably forever remain a mystery. And we can go through a few more of the... I shot some of the groups. These are two of the curlews in the collection. You can see the paint's a little different. You can see this one has much more fanciful feather painting than this one. And then there's 3 ruddy turnstones. Again, you can see, some have more of this feather painting in the back than others, but they're all wonderfully detailed painting. Again, there's a little paint loss to the tip of the bill. There's a little paint loss here. For some reason, the hardwood bills didn't hold the paint as well. There's 2 more turnstones. These are dowitchers. 3 more dowitchers from the collection. It was pretty fantastic to be able to see all 36 or all 33 that's still in the collection laid out on the table. And I really feel grateful to have had the opportunity to handle them all. There's 2 more dowitchers. These are 3 robin snipe. These are 2 of the golden plovers. Those are 2 in their collection. 3 black-bellied plovers. And there's the a willet, or 2 willets and a greater yellowlegs. And like I say, they have the split tails along with the curlews. And they are my favorites. And I think that's it. Anybody got any questions? Huh?
Do all those have a carved face to the bill?
No.
They all look like they had a carved face.
No, that's painted on. It
looks like it comes out to the bill always.
Well, you see, this is paint.
Oh, okay. That's where it ends?
Yeah. Now, the bill is straight right there. The bill is flat, okay. Where it enters. But he did the paint. He pulled the paint on all of them up into the face a little bit. And they all have glass eyes.
Yeah, some of them just look like the bill started further out away.
Yeah.
From the pictures.
Yeah, and I understand that if anyone would ever like to see them in person, it can be arranged. I was fortunate enough. Like I said, in 2016, I said, I got to go see these shorebirds. Well, it took me only almost 10 years to get there, but
That's the year we went up there, and the lady was on vacation, so we couldn't see
Yeah.
her. Nanny and I drove all the way up there to see them.
so, but I saw this summer at the Clayton show, Timmy Seeger mentioned to me that he had gone to see him, he and a couple other guys, and they had made arrangements. And I found out that this guy, Jeff Pressman, who's a collector from San Diego, is the chairman of the board of this museum in Cooperstown, New York. So I saw him in the Waterfowl Festival in Easton. I said, Jeff, I want to get in there and see these shorebirds. And he whips his cell phone out. He calls the president of the museum. He goes, this guy named Joe Engers is going to call you to come up and see the shorebirds, accommodate him. So, it was really, really, really nice to go up and see him. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. That's good.